The phone call came while I was cleaning up from the morning rush, wiping down tables and rearranging stools. I worked the day shift at the bar, a quiet, predictable gig that fit well with my routine. My job was straightforward: handle the early regulars, keep the place clean, and stock the shelves for the night crew. It was repetitive work, but I liked it. The man who usually took over for the night shift was dependable, if not overly friendly. He'd show up right on time, nod in my direction, and settle in behind the bar without much small talk. I didn't know much about him beyond his name, and honestly, I never felt the need to ask. But that day, as I scrubbed the bar counter, the phone rang, and the manager's voice on the other end instantly threw off my rhythm. He sounded uneasy, even hurried. "Hey, listen," he started, skipping any greeting. "Night guy didn't show up last night, and we haven't heard from him all day. I need someone to cover tonight." I frowned, glancing at the empty bar. "Why me?" I asked, not hiding the reluctance in my voice. "I don't do nights. You know that." There was a pause. Then the manager cleared his throat. "I know, but we're short-staffed, and I can't afford to close for the night. It's just one shift. I'll throw in extra pay. Just lock up when you're done, and don't worry about anything else." Something in his tone didn't sit right with me, but I chalked it up to stress. Managers get overwhelmed, especially when someone bails unexpectedly. Still, the idea of working the night shift didn't appeal to me. I liked the daylight, the safety of regulars filtering in and out. The bar at night had a reputation not for being dangerous, but for being strange. I couldn't put my finger on why, but the thought of spending hours there alone made my stomach twist. I didn't have much of a choice, though. The manager wasn't asking. He was telling me I had to do it and I needed the money. So I agreed. He told me to swing by in the evening for a quick rundown before the shift. I thought it was strange. What was there to explain? Stocking shelves and pouring drinks didn't require much of a briefing. Still, I showed up as instructed, and when I walked in, he was waiting by the bar, a piece of paper in his hand. "What's this?" I asked, taking the note from him. His face looked pale, and his eyes darted around like he expected something to jump out of the shadows. "Just follow these, okay? Don't ask questions. Just follow them and you'll be fine." That word again, fine. It sounded more like a warning than reassurance. I unfolded the paper and scanned the list. At first, I thought it was an April Fool's joke, but it wasn't even April. Rules about creaking doors, jukeboxes, shadows, and laughter? It didn't make sense. "You're serious?" I asked, looking up at him. He nodded, his expression grim. "Dead serious. Look, I can't explain it, but trust me, these are important. Do exactly what they say, and you'll get through the night." I didn't argue, though I wanted to. Something about the way he handed me the note, like it was some kind of lifeline. "Oh yeah, before I leave, make sure you do not exit your shift before it ends. If you do, well, let's just say something will be waiting for you outside before the end of your shift." As soon as he finished that sentence, I felt chills everywhere. I didn't know how to reply. What does he mean by saying something is waiting for me during my shift? What am I supposed to do? What can I do? Straight after, he left, practically sprinting out the door, leaving me alone in the dimly lit bar. I stood there, unsure of what to do. The place felt different at night. During the day, sunlight filtered through the frosted windows, giving the bar a warm, inviting glow. I got the rules out from my pocket just to read them again, to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Rule 1. If you hear the front door creak open but see no one enter, step behind the bar and pretend to be cleaning glasses. You are not alone, and you must act natural until it leaves. Rule 2. If a man with a black hat orders the usual, pour him the strongest whiskey you have and place it on the far left end of the bar. Do not acknowledge him again. He will leave on his own. Rule 3. If the jukebox begins to play on its own, do not stop it. If a shadow appears near the jukebox, do not approach it. Instead, wipe down the bar counter until the song finishes. It does not like being acknowledged. Rule 4. If the lights flicker, immediately check the storage closet. If the door is open, close it and lock it. You mustn't let it stay open. Rule 5. Occasionally, you may hear soft laughter coming from somewhere behind you, even if no one else is in the bar. Do not turn around. Politely say, "I'm glad you're enjoying yourself," and keep working. She will not harm you as long as you acknowledge her presence kindly. Rule 6. There is a small silver bell under the bar counter. Only ring it if you feel someone is standing directly behind you but see no one when you turn around. The bell will not stop the feeling but will prevent it from escalating. Rule 7. If the window behind the bar opens by itself, shut it immediately and firmly without looking outside. If you see someone looking in from the other side, wave to them and politely say, "Sorry, we're closed." Then lock the window and ignore any further movement. Baffled and confused, I walked behind the bar and began organizing the bottles, trying to focus on mundane tasks to keep my mind from wandering. The rules nagged at me, though. I couldn't stop thinking about them, about how absurd they sounded. But I couldn't shake the manager's expression from my mind either. He had been genuinely scared, and that fear was starting to rub off on me. For the first hour or so, nothing happened. The bar stayed quiet, the only sounds coming from the occasional groan of the old building settling. I kept myself busy, wiping down the counter and restocking glasses. Every so often, I glanced at the folded note in my pocket, debating whether to pull it out and read through it again. But I didn't need to. The rules were already etched into my memory, their strange instructions circling in my mind like a broken record. When the front door creaked open, my heart nearly stopped. I snapped my head toward it, expecting to see someone walking in, but the doorway was empty. The door itself was shut tight, and the air felt heavy, like the room was holding its breath. Rule 1. If you hear the front door creak open but see no one enter, step behind the bar and pretend to be cleaning glasses. You are not alone, and you must act natural until it leaves. My hands moved on autopilot, grabbing a glass and a rag as I stepped behind the bar. I kept my eyes down, focusing on the motion of my hands. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to breathe evenly, to act like nothing was out of the ordinary. The feeling of being watched was unbearable. I couldn't see anything out of the corner of my eye, but the sensation was undeniable, like a presence lingering just out of sight. I wanted to look to confirm that nothing was there, but I didn't dare. The rule was clear: act natural. Clean the glasses. So I did, my movements slow and deliberate, my breath shallow as I waited for the tension to break. After what felt like an eternity, the oppressive weight lifted, and the air in the room seemed to loosen. I didn't stop cleaning until I was sure it was gone. When I finally looked up, the room was empty, just as it had been before. I let out a shaky breath and set the glass down, my hands trembling. That was only the first rule, I reminded myself. There were 6 more, each more unsettling than the last. I glanced toward the jukebox in the corner, half expecting it to spring to life. The silence felt more threatening now, as if the bar itself was waiting for the next move. I wasn't sure if I could handle this, but it was too late to back out. I had agreed to the shift, and now I was in it whether I liked it or not, and I couldn't leave. Something was waiting for me. As I steadied my breathing and tried to calm the shaking in my hands, I reminded myself that I'd signed up for this shift, though I hadn't signed up for the rules or the creeping sense of dread that came with them. The manager's parting words echoed in my mind like a drumbeat I couldn't escape. "You can't leave. There's something waiting outside for you." I hadn't questioned it then, too caught up in the absurdity of the list he'd handed me. But now those words felt like a noose tightening around my neck. Why hadn't I asked for more? Why hadn't I pushed him to explain what he meant? Something about the way he'd said it, flat and definitive, had killed any resistance I might have had in the moment. The reality of it was settling in now, though like a stone lodged deep in my chest. Whatever was waiting out there, it made the claustrophobic safety of the bar feel like the lesser of two evils. I busied myself restocking the shelves, trying to ground myself with the mechanical repetition of sorting bottles by size and label. My eyes kept flicking toward the note crammed into my pocket, as if it might rewrite itself with some clearer explanation. I was so focused on the shelves that when the jukebox suddenly burst to life, I nearly dropped the bottle of gin in my hand. The song was one I didn't recognize, something old with a haunting melody, the kind of tune that didn't belong in a place like this. My pulse quickened as I instinctively turned toward the sound. Then I froze, the rule hammering into my brain like a warning siren. If the jukebox begins to play on its own, do not stop it. If a shadow appears near the jukebox, do not approach it. Instead, wipe down the bar counter until the song finishes. It does not like being acknowledged. The low, crackling notes of the song filled the air, twisting around me like a coiled snake, and I forced myself to move. I shuffled back to the bar, grabbing a rag and focusing on the counter as though my life depended on it. Maybe it did. I scrubbed the already clean surface in slow, deliberate circles, my movements stiff and robotic, trying to ignore the growing pressure in the room. I couldn't see the jukebox from where I stood, but that only made it worse. The air felt thick again, heavy with something unseen but undeniably present. I kept my eyes down, scrubbing and scrubbing, the melody burrowing deeper into my mind with each passing second. My peripheral vision caught something, a flicker of movement near the jukebox. It wasn't sharp or sudden, but it was there, like the faint outline of something swaying. My chest tightened, but I didn't dare look up. The rule was clear: do not approach, do not acknowledge. The song seemed to drag on forever, its tempo slow and uneven, like it was being played on a warped record. My grip on the rag tightened as I scrubbed harder, the sound of fabric on wood blending awkwardly with the eerie music. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the jukebox fell silent. The absence of sound was almost more jarring than the music itself. I stopped wiping the counter, my arm trembling from the tension. I stayed rooted to the spot, waiting, listening. It wasn't until I was sure that whatever presence had been near the jukebox was gone that I allowed myself to glance toward it. The machine stood still and lifeless, just as it had when I'd arrived. But something about its glossy surface seemed different, like it had been touched by hands that shouldn't exist. I pushed the thought out of my mind, not wanting to linger on it. I told myself I'd gotten through 2 of the rules now. That had to mean something, didn't it? I wasn't sure what to expect next, but the stillness in the bar felt more oppressive with each passing minute. I leaned on the counter, letting out a shaky breath, when I heard it. A soft, airy laugh, almost playful, coming from somewhere behind me. My blood ran cold. Rule 5. Occasionally, you may hear soft laughter coming from somewhere behind you, even if no one else is in the bar. Do not turn around. Politely say, "I'm glad you're enjoying yourself," and keep working. She will not harm you as long as you acknowledge her presence kindly. The sound sent a ripple of dread through me, but I couldn't risk breaking the rule. I clenched my jaw, forcing my lips to form the words as calmly as I could manage. "I'm glad you're enjoying yourself," I said, my voice shaky but audible. The laughter stopped immediately, as if someone had flipped a switch. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself, a void that felt unnaturally deep. I didn't turn around, couldn't. My hands twitched with the need to move, to do something to distract myself. But I was terrified that even the slightest motion might provoke whatever had been behind me. Slowly, I reached for a glass and began drying it with the rag, trying to mimic the natural rhythm I'd used earlier. My ears strained for any hint of movement, but there was nothing, no footsteps, no breathing, just the heavy quiet of the room. The only thing grounding me was the routine of cleaning, the motion keeping me from spiraling into panic. I set the glass down and moved to restock the mixers, desperate for something else to focus on. The rules were all-consuming now, each one burned into my memory, waiting to spring to life with the next sound or movement. I felt like I was walking a tightrope, every step balanced precariously over an abyss I couldn't see. As I reached for a bottle of soda, the lights above me flickered. A chill ran down my spine. Rule 4. If the lights flicker, immediately check the storage closet. If the door is open, close it and lock it. You mustn't let it stay open. My eyes darted toward the back of the bar, where the storage closet stood just out of sight. I hesitated, my body frozen with indecision. I didn't want to move. My instincts screamed at me to stay where I was, but the rule left no room for debate. If the door was open, I had to shut it. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I forced myself to walk toward the closet. When I rounded the corner, my breath hitched. The door was open, not wide open, but just enough to reveal the yawning blackness inside. The open door was like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. The blackness beyond it felt unnatural, a void that didn't belong in a place that should have been full of the mundane. Shelves stocked with bottles, cleaning supplies, boxes of napkins. It was as if that little storage closet had become a doorway to something else entirely, something that was wrong. I couldn't see anything inside, no outline of the shelves, no shape of the mop leaning in the corner, just emptiness. I took a small step forward, my pulse throbbing in my temples. The rule was simple, clear. If the door was open, I had to shut it and lock it. But the thought of reaching for that door handle made my stomach twist in a way I couldn't shake. I didn't want to look inside, didn't want to know what could be lurking in that pitch-black space. But I had no choice. I had to. I stepped closer, and the sound of my shoes on the floor was louder than it should have been. Every creak of the floorboards beneath my feet seemed to echo like a warning. I reached for the handle, and my fingers barely brushed it when the lights flickered again. This time, they didn't just flicker. They stuttered, each one dimming and flaring in rapid succession. For a moment, the bar plunged into darkness, and my heart skipped. The lights came back on, but the flickering hadn't stopped entirely. My hand still hovered over the handle. I swallowed, gathering what little composure I had left, and yanked the door shut. The click of the lock was louder than it should have been, and I stood frozen for a moment, waiting for something, anything to happen. The room was eerily quiet, save for the hum of the overhead lights. The fear that had been gnawing at me settled into the pit of my stomach, and I turned back toward the bar, trying to shake the feeling that something was watching me from the other side of that locked door. It was a ridiculous thought, right? That closet was just a closet. But as I walked back toward the counter, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't the door I needed to be worried about. Just then, the hairs on the back of my neck pricked up, and the unmistakable sound of the front door creaking open filled the room. It was quiet at first, slow and deliberate. I froze, trying not to make a sound, trying not to give away the fact that I knew what was happening. I glanced toward the entrance. The door was wide open, but there was no one there, no one standing in the doorway. The stillness that followed felt suffocating, and I had to fight the urge to rush to the door and check for myself. But the rules were clear. If you hear the front door creak open but see no one enter, step behind the bar and pretend to be cleaning glasses. You are not alone, and you must act natural until it leaves. I didn't hesitate. I moved swiftly, almost mechanically, behind the bar, pulling the rag back into my hand as if it were second nature. My heart raced as I wiped down the counter, doing my best to appear normal, trying to breathe as quietly as possible. Couldn't let it know I was aware. Couldn't risk it. The air felt heavier now, thick with anticipation, and I could almost hear the faintest shuffle of footsteps, barely there, like someone or something was standing just outside my range of vision. I kept scrubbing, forcing my hands to move fluidly, making it seem like I hadn't noticed a thing. The silence stretched on, oppressively thick. My focus was breaking. I was waiting for something to happen, and I could feel the seconds dragging on forever. The tension in the air was palpable, like the entire room was holding its breath. And then, without warning, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, rattling the walls. I flinched, the rag slipping from my hand. My pulse hammered in my ears as I stood frozen behind the bar, every muscle tense and coiled, ready to bolt. But nothing happened. No footsteps, no movement, just silence, except for the quiet hum of the lights and the faraway drip of the tap. I slowly reached down to grab the rag again, forcing myself to continue with my work. I couldn't help but glance toward the door to make sure it was shut. Before I could settle into the rhythm again, the window behind the bar creaked open. I didn't even need to look to know it was true. I felt it, the shift in the room, the chill that crawled into my bones the moment that window opened. If the window behind the bar opens by itself, shut it immediately and firmly without looking outside. If you see someone looking in from the other side, wave to them and politely say, "Sorry, we're closed." Then lock the window and ignore any further movement. I took 2 steps toward the window, my heart pounding in my chest, and without thinking, I slammed it shut, pressing my palm against the cool glass as if it might shatter from the force. I didn't dare glance outside. My hand locked the window with trembling fingers, but just before I turned away, I caught a glimpse of movement. Someone standing just beyond the glass, their silhouette barely discernible in the dim light. I didn't look, couldn't, but I followed the rule. "Sorry, we're closed," I said, the words leaving my mouth before I even realized I'd spoken. I locked the window and turned away, doing my best to ignore the sensation of eyes on me, the pressure of being watched. The bar was silent again, but the silence felt wrong. The longer I stayed, the more I wondered if leaving would be worse than staying. I had thought that the worst of it was behind me. The window had been closed, the laughter had stopped, and the door had slammed with a finality that made me think maybe, just maybe, it was over. I could feel the weight of the night pressing against my chest, each passing minute dragging me further into the unease that had already settled in my bones. The silence in the bar was thick, like something was waiting for me to make the next move, like the entire room was holding its breath, anticipating my next step. But as the seconds ticked by, I started to convince myself that nothing would happen again. I was just being paranoid. There was no reason to keep thinking about the rules, no reason to stay on edge. Then I heard it, a faint shift in the air, so quiet I almost missed it. It wasn't a sound, but a sensation, a sudden, unnatural presence. My skin prickled, and the hairs on my neck stood up again. I glanced around, and there it was, that familiar feeling of someone standing just behind me. Though when I looked, no one was there. I couldn't even explain it. It wasn't a noise, it wasn't a movement. It was just there, like a weight hanging over me. That moment of stillness that crept up so quietly, I hadn't even realized it was happening until it was too late. The rule shot right in my mind, clear as day. There is a small silver bell under the bar counter. Only ring it if you feel someone is standing directly behind you but see no one when you turn around. The bell will not stop the feeling but will prevent it from escalating. I didn't want to touch it. I didn't want to acknowledge it. But that feeling, something was there. Something I couldn't see but could feel, was making my lungs feel tight. I reached under the counter, my fingers grazing the cold metal of the small bell, and my breath hitched as I slowly, almost reluctantly, tapped it. The sound was faint, delicate, but it rang out in the stillness, and for a moment, the pressure in the room lifted. The feeling of being watched didn't vanish, but it didn't escalate either. I dared to breathe again, my heart still pounding in my chest, but at least the sensation was contained. For now. I didn't know if it had helped or not, but I wasn't about to take any chances. I glanced up, the bar still silent, but something shifted in the atmosphere, something I couldn't place. Then, a sound I hadn't expected. The front door, creaked open once again. But this time, I didn't hear the faint shuffle of footsteps or the unsettling emptiness that had greeted me before. No, this time, there was a figure standing in the doorway, framed in the dim light. A man in a black hat, his silhouette cutting a stark contrast against the night outside. He stood there for a moment, just standing, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. Even though I had been through a lot, I was nowhere near ready for this to happen. I had to quickly recall Rule 2. If a man with a black hat orders the usual, pour him the strongest whiskey you have and place it on the far left end of the bar. Do not acknowledge him again. He will leave on his own. I didn't move at first, frozen as I stared at him, my body screaming at me to do something, anything. He hadn't spoken, neither did he make a sound, but his presence was loud, too loud. I glanced down at the counter, my hand shaking as I grabbed the bottle of the strongest whiskey we had. I poured it into the glass, feeling the coldness of the bottle slip through my trembling fingers. The glass was full in an instant, the amber liquid swirling like a pool of fire. My hand moved automatically, placing the glass on the far left end of the bar, and I didn't look up. I kept my gaze fixed on the counter, focusing on the task in front of me, forcing myself to ignore the man standing just a few feet away. The rules were simple. I had to stick to them. I didn't need to acknowledge him again. The room was suffocatingly still. The faintest whisper of air moved past me as I continued wiping the counter, my hands moving almost mechanically. Time seemed to slow, as if the world wanted me to suffer. I could feel his presence, but I didn't dare look up. The sound of my rag against the counter was deafening, a sound that seemed to fill the entire space between us. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the man in the black hat moved. He stepped away from the bar, his footsteps soft but distinct. I could hear the creak of the door as it opened again. He didn't say a word, didn't even glance back. The door slammed shut behind him with a finality that made the room feel even colder than before. For a long moment, I stayed frozen behind the bar, my body tense, my mind racing. I had followed the rules. He had left, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, that I was still being watched. My hands gripped the edge of the bar, and I glanced toward the door, the cold draft slipping through the cracks where the door met the frame. The rules had kept me here, had kept me safe, but what did they really protect me from? What had I just let slip past me? I didn't know how much longer I could keep this up, but the thought of leaving was just as terrifying. Something out there, something I couldn't see, was waiting. I knew it now. It wasn't just the strange occurrences. It wasn't just the eerie sounds or the rules I had to follow. There was something more, something waiting for me if I left. I stood behind the bar for what felt like an eternity, my breath shallow, my pulse still quick. The clock ticked on, the minutes slipping past without me noticing. There was no more laughter, no more creaks from the door, no more flickering lights. But I knew I had kept something at bay. I had to complete this shift to prevent something far more worse from happening. And then, finally, I saw it. The morning light creeping through the cracks in the blinds. The sun was rising. The shift was over. I could leave. The door was in front of me. I wasn't alone anymore. But as I reached for the door, the bell rang once more. Soft, delicate, and unmistakable. I turned, but I was alone. I stepped outside into the early morning light, taking one last glance over my shoulder before I closed the door behind me. I didn't look back as I walked away, leaving the bar behind. I got my money and left the job without a word. I didn't care about being jobless, I just didn't care. There is no way I could set foot back in the bar even in the mornings, knowing what goes on. So if your colleague goes missing and your boss wants you to cover his shift, do not accept it, even if it means you are getting fired.